The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when I buried her. I remember that more than anything else. Not the priest's voice, not the smell of the lilies my wife had loved, not even the sound of the dirt hitting the casket. Just the rain, cold November rain that came down sideways, the kind that gets under your collar no matter how high you turn it up. I stood there in a black suit that didn't fit me anymore. I'd lost 12 pounds in the 4 months she was sick, the pants bunched at the waist where I'd cinched my belt to the last hole. My shoes were ruined within 20 minutes. Cheap dress shoes never were meant for cemetery grass in a downpour. The priest, a young man named Father Halsey, kept glancing at the empty folding chairs. There were 40 of them. We'd ordered 40 because that's how many people Margaret thought might come. Cousins. Old friends from her teaching days at the elementary school. The neighbors. The women from her book club. Our pastor from when we still went to St. Sa. Marks before the new building campaign drove us away. Her sister down in Tampa, who couldn't fly because of her hip. 40 seemed reasonable. Conservative even. 2 showed up. Father Halsey, of course, because he was paid to. And Mrs. Whitcomb, who lived 3 doors down and had brought Margaret soup every Tuesday for the last 2 months of her life. Mrs. Whitcomb was 84 years old and walked with a cane, and she'd taken a taxi to the cemetery because her son was at work and couldn't drive her. She held an umbrella that kept turning inside out. I watched her struggle with it for 10 minutes before I walked over and took it from her hands and held it over both of us. "I'm so sorry, dear," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." I didn't know if she was sorry about Margaret or sorry about the chairs. Maybe both. My son and daughter were not there. I want to be clear about that right at the start, because everything that comes after hinges on it. They were not there. They knew the date. They knew the time. They had been told 3 weeks in advance, the day after their mother died, when I called each of them from the hospital parking lot still wearing the cardigan she had bought me for our anniversary. They had not been there for that either, but I let it slide because grief makes you forgive things. Grief makes you a fool. My son told me he had a board meeting he couldn't reschedule. He runs an investment firm in Charlotte. Or he says he does. I've stopped trying to figure out what my son actually does for a living. He uses words like verticals and synergies, and I just nod. He told me on the phone while I sat in the parking lot of the hospital where his mother had just stopped breathing 15 minutes earlier, that he would absolutely make it work. Then, 3 weeks later, he called the night before the funeral and told me about the board meeting and how it just couldn't be moved. My daughter told me she had a wellness retreat in Sedona that had been booked for 6 months, non-refundable. Her words, she said the retreat was really important for her healing journey, and that her mother would have wanted her to take care of herself first. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. Her mother, whose body was in a refrigerated drawer at Crenshaw Funeral Home, would have wanted her to take care of herself first. By going to Sedona to do yoga. With strangers. 3 days after we put her mother in the ground. I am 67 years old. My name doesn't matter for this story. Call me the father. Call me the husband. Call me the old man who stood alone in the rain. I worked for 43 years. I built a company from nothing, a small machine parts business that I started in my garage in 1981 with $3,000 I'd saved from working night shifts at a warehouse. By 2005, we were the second largest supplier in the state. By 2015, I'd sold a controlling interest to a private equity firm but stayed on as chairman. And the proceeds from that sale, combined with the investments Margaret and I had made together over 4 decades of careful, boring, unglamorous saving, made us, by the standards of normal Americans, very wealthy. The number doesn't matter. It was enough that my children noticed. Margaret never wanted them to know, not the specifics. She used to say that knowing the number ruined people, and she was right about that. The way she was right about most things. I want to tell you about my wife before I tell you about my children, because otherwise none of it will make sense. Margaret was the smartest person I ever met. She graduated from a small college in Pennsylvania in 1978 with a degree in literature, and an offer to do graduate work at Penn that she turned down because her mother was dying and she wanted to be home. She taught fourth grade for 31 years and could quote Shakespeare from memory, and could also rebuild a carburetor, which she learned from her uncle when she was 12. She made the best apple pie I have ever tasted, with a lattice crust that she insisted had to be done by hand, no shortcuts. She read 3 books a week. She kept a garden. She hated talking on the phone. She loved Gershwin. She cried at parades. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in July. They told us 4 to 6 months, and they were generous, because she lasted 4 months and 1 week. She refused chemo after the first round because she said she'd rather have 10 clear weeks than 20 foggy ones, and that was Margaret all over. She knew about the kids. She knew before I did. About 6 weeks before she died, on a Saturday afternoon, when she was strong enough to sit out on the back porch with a blanket over her legs, she asked me to make her a cup of tea. When I came back, she had a yellow legal pad on her lap and a pen in her hand, and she said, "I want to talk about the will." I told her we'd already done the will. Years ago. Everything to the survivor. Then split equally between our son and daughter when we both were gone. She said, "I want to change it." I sat down. I remember the wicker chair creaking. I remember a cardinal landing on the bird feeder she had insisted I install the previous spring. I remember her face was very calm, which was the thing about Margaret. Toward the end, the sicker she got, the calmer she became, like she was settling into something. "They're going to come for it," she said. After. "They're going to come for everything, and you're going to want to give it to them, because that's who you are, and I love you for it, and I need you to promise me that you won't." I said, "Honey, that's not fair. They love us." She looked at me with the same look she used to give the kids when they were small and lying about who broke the vase. She said, "They love what we can give them, and that's not the same." I want to tell you that I argue with her. I want to tell you that I defended my children. The truth is, I sat in that wicker chair, and I felt something cold and old move through my stomach. Because I knew on some level I had been refusing to look at for probably 10 years that she was right. My son. Let me tell you about my son. He is 41 years old. He is handsome, the way men in catalogs are handsome, with very white teeth and a haircut that costs more than my first car. He drives a German SUV that he replaces every 2 years. His wife is named Brittany, and she is his third wife, and she is 26 years old, and she calls me Pops in a way that makes my skin crawl. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I have seen 4 times in the last 3 years. When my son was in college, I caught him stealing from me. He'd taken my American Express card from the dresser one weekend when he was home and run up almost $6,000 on it before I noticed. When I confronted him, he cried and said he had a problem and he needed help. I paid for the rehab. He stayed 3 weeks. He went back to school. We never spoke of it again. Margaret wanted to. I wouldn't let her. That should have told me something. It told her something. When my son was 26, his first wife left him because, she told me later, in a long, tearful phone call I never told Margaret about, he had been sleeping with one of her bridesmaids since 6 months before the wedding. His second wife left him because, and I'm quoting from court papers I had to read because he asked me to help with the legal fees, of sustained financial deception and emotional abuse. Brittany is his third wife. She was 22 when they married. He was 38. I'm not going to speculate about Brittany. My daughter's 38. She lives in a condo in Scottsdale that I bought for her in 2019 when she told me she was leaving her husband and needed space to find herself. I paid the down payment, which was $80,000. I also paid off her credit card debt at that time, which was $41,000. I did this without telling Margaret, which is one of the few things I lied to my wife about in 46 years of marriage. Margaret found out anyway, because she was Margaret, and she didn't speak to me for 2 days, and then she said very quietly, over breakfast, "You just made it worse." My daughter has not held a job for longer than 14 months at any point in her adult life. She is a wellness coach now, which means she posts pictures of herself in yoga pants on the internet and sells supplements from a company that I have come to understand is some kind of pyramid scheme. She has been in 3 serious relationships since the divorce, and each one ended with her calling me at midnight, crying, asking for money. I have given her, by my accountant's count, over $240,000 in the last 7 years. Not loans, gifts, because she always called them gifts after the fact. Margaret knew about all of it. I did not understand how she knew, because I was very careful about hiding it from her. But Margaret knew. Margaret always knew. So that Saturday on the back porch, with the cardinal at the feeder and the tea going cold in her hand, she told me what she wanted to do. She wanted to put everything in a trust. Not the simple kind, the complicated kind, with conditions and triggers and provisions she had been quietly researching for. It turned out almost 2 years. She wanted me to be the sole beneficiary while I live. She wanted, after my death, the bulk of the estate to go to a foundation for elementary school teachers, in her name, administered by a board that would not include either of our children. She wanted our son and our daughter to receive, each, a one-time payment of $50,000, contingent on their attending her funeral. I want to repeat that. Contingent on their attending her funeral. Why? I asked her. She said, because I want to know. She said, I don't want to die wondering. I want to die knowing. And I want you to know, too, because you're going to be alone. And I need you to be alone with the truth, not with a lie I let you keep believing. I cried. I'm not embarrassed to tell you that. I sat on the back porch, and I cried, and my dying wife held my hand and let me cry. And she said, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. We met with the lawyer the following Tuesday. His name was Mr. Kessling, and he had been our attorney for 30 years, and I had to drive Margaret to his office because she was too weak to walk from the parking lot. We sat in his conference room with the leather chairs and the pictures of his grandchildren on the credenza, and Margaret laid out everything she wanted, and Mr. Kessling, who had known us since our kids were small, did not say a word until she was done. Then he looked at me. He looked at me for a long time. He said, Are you in agreement with this? I said yes. He said, I need to ask you that twice, because I have known you a long time, and I don't want you to do this if you're not in agreement. Margaret held my hand under the table. I said, I'm in agreement. The papers were signed 11 days before she died. She was lucid the entire time. Mr. Kessling had insisted on a doctor's affidavit and a witness and a video recording, because he knew, the way Margaret knew, the way I should have known, what was coming. She died on a Wednesday morning at 4:17 a.m. I was holding her hand. The hospice nurse, a woman named Lorena, who had been with us for the final 2 weeks, was in the room. Margaret had been mostly unconscious for the previous 36 hours. She woke up once, briefly, around 3:50, and she looked at me and she said, Don't be afraid. And then she went back to sleep. And then, 27 minutes later, she stopped breathing. I called my son at 4:45. He didn't answer. I left a message. He called me back at 7:30 in the morning, 3 hours later. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said he'd make it work to get up for the funeral. I told him the date and the time. He said he put it in his calendar. I called my daughter at 4:50. She answered immediately, which I thought meant something. She cried on the phone for 10 minutes. She said her mother had been her best friend. She said she didn't know how she would live without her. She said she would be on the next flight. Then, 2 days later, she called me back to tell me about Sedona. The funeral was on a Saturday. I won't describe the rain again. I stood at the graveside after Father Halsey was done, and after Mrs. Heder. Whitcomb had taken her taxi home, and after the cemetery workers had moved away to give me privacy, and I stood there alone in the rain for, maybe 40 minutes. I talked to her. I told her I was sorry I hadn't believed her sooner. I told her she had been right about everything. I told her I loved her. I told her I would do what she had asked. Then I went home to an empty house, and I called Mr. Kessling's office, and I left a message with his answering service, because it was Saturday, that said, neither of them came. Proceed as we discussed. He called me back on Monday morning at 9:01. He said, I'm so sorry. I said. I know you are. He said, I'll have the documents ready by Wednesday. The next part I'm going to tell you carefully because I want you to understand the order of things. I want you to understand that I did not pursue my children. I did not call them. I did not summon them. I did not, as my son later accused me of doing, set a trap. I simply went home, and I waited, because I knew, as Margaret had known, that they would come. They would come because that's what they did. They came when they wanted something. My son arrived on Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the funeral. He drove up to the house in his German SUV with his wife in the passenger seat, and they let themselves in through the front door without knocking, the way they always had, and he called out, "Pop, you home?" I was in the kitchen making a sandwich. I came out. Brittany was wearing sunglasses indoors and what appeared to be exercise clothing, although she had clearly not been exercising. My son was wearing a polo shirt and slacks, and he had his hands in his pockets, which was always a tell with him going back to childhood. Hands in pockets meant he was about to ask for something. He said, "Pop, we need to talk." I said, "All right." He said, "I'm sorry I missed the funeral. The board meeting was a disaster. I couldn't get out of it, you understand." I said, "All right." He sat down at the kitchen table. Brittany stood by the window, looking at her phone. He said, "I think we need to start sorting some things out. The estate, Mom's things, the accounts." I said, "We?" He looked at me. He smiled. It was the smile he had used since he was 4 years old when he wanted something, and it had worked for 37 years, and he could not conceive that it would not work now. He said, "Pop, come on. I know it's hard. But we have to be practical. There's the company stake, there's the investment accounts, there's this house, there's a lot to manage. And, I'm in a position to help." "Professionally," I said. "Help with what?" He said, "I think it makes sense to consolidate Mom's assets into a structure I can oversee, just temporarily, while you adjust. I've got contacts at Fidelity. I can move things over, get you set up with a manager, take the burden off your shoulders." I looked at him for a long time. I looked at him until he stopped smiling and started shifting in his chair. Brittany glanced up from her phone. I said, "Where's your sister?" He said, "She's flying in tonight. She wanted to come up tomorrow. We thought it would be better to do this together, as a family." He said the word family like it was a punctuation mark. I said, "That's fine. Tomorrow's fine. Come back tomorrow. Bring your sister. We can talk then." He looked surprised. He had expected an argument, or tears, or capitulation. He had not expected nothing. He stood up and put his hands back in his pockets, and he said, "All right, Pop, tomorrow. Around 11, I'll bring lunch." I said, "I'll have lunch already." They left. I watched them drive away through the kitchen window. Brittany was already on her phone before they got to the end of the driveway. I called Mr. Kesseling. I told him they were coming the next day. He asked if I wanted him present. I said no. I said I wanted to do this part myself. He said he understood. He said the courier would be at my house at 10:45 sharp. That night I sat in the living room with all the lights off, and I looked at the picture of Margaret on the mantel. It was from a vacation we took in 1996 in May. She was on a beach in a white sweater, laughing, the wind in her hair. She was 47 years old in that picture, and I had thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and I was right. I said out loud, "Tomorrow, sweetheart. Tomorrow I do what you asked." She didn't answer. She wasn't there. But I felt better anyway. My daughter showed up first, at 10:30. She was wearing leggings and a tank top that said Jarrett Full across the front in cursive script, and she had a small designer dog under one arm that I had never seen before and that she did not introduce. She hugged me and held on to me for what she clearly believed was the correct amount of time, and then she stepped back and looked at me with wet eyes and said, "Daddy, how are you holding up?" I said, "I'm getting by." She said, "I keep thinking about her. Every meditation, every sun salutation, she was right there with me." I did not respond to that. she said. Sedona was hard. I don't think we'll understand how hard it was for me to be there, missing her. But the facilitator said grief is just love with nowhere to go. And I think that's so beautiful, don't you? I did not respond to that either. My son arrived at 10:55 with Brittany. The four of us sat in the living room. The dog peed on the rug. My daughter laughed and said, "Oh, Mr. Pickles, you naughty boy," and made no move to clean it up. I went and got paper towels. The doorbell rang at 10:46. The courier was an older gentleman in the dark suit, very precise, very polite. He handed me a thick envelope and a clipboard. I signed for it. He nodded and left. I came back into the living room with the envelope. My son said, "What's that?" I said. "Your mother's will. The amended version. She had it changed about 6 weeks before she died." He said, "What do you mean, the amended version?" I sat down. I put the envelope on the coffee table. I said, "I think you both should sit down." Brittany was already looking at her phone again. My daughter sat next to my son on the couch. The dog, having peed, was now chewing on a tassel of one of the throw pillows, which was a pillow Margaret had needle-pointed in 1989. I said, "Your mother knew you weren't going to come to the funeral. She didn't know for sure, but she suspected. And she put a clause in the will that said each of you would receive $50,000, but only if you attended the service." There was a silence. My daughter said, "What?" I said, "Neither of you came, so neither of you receives the $50,000. My son laughed. Actually laughed. He said, "Pop, that's ridiculous. That's not enforceable. You can't put conditions like that on inheritance." I said, "Mr. Misterable, you can't put conditions like that on inheritance." I said, "Mr. Masturbate, Kessling assures me it is enforceable. Your mother had it drafted very carefully. There were medical affidavits, witnesses, video recordings. She was of sound mind. The clause is, in his words, extremely robust." My daughter said, "But Daddy, I didn't know. I would have come if I had known." I said, "You knew the funeral was on Saturday. I told you on Wednesday, 3 days before. You went to Sedona instead." She said, "But I didn't know about the will, about the money. If I had known." She stopped, because she heard what she was saying. I let the silence sit. My son, who recovered faster, said, Okay, fine, 50,000. We can talk about that later." "What's the rest of it?" I said. "The rest of it isn't a trust. I'm the sole beneficiary while I'm alive. After I die, the bulk of the estate goes to a foundation in your mother's name to support elementary school teachers. The foundation will be administered by a board that does not include either of you." My son said, "What?" He said it like a statement, not a question. I said, "You heard me." He stood up. He said, Pop. That's our money. That's our inheritance. You can't just give it to teachers." I said, "It was your mother's money. And mine. And we can give it to whoever we please." He said, "I'll fight this." I said, "I'll fight this." I said, "Kessling has been waiting for you to say that for several weeks. He is prepared accordingly." My daughter started to cry. Real tears this time, not the performance from the doorway. She said, "Why? Why are you doing this to us?" I looked at her. I said, "I'm not doing anything to you. Your mother did this. And she did it because she knew you. And she loved you anyway. And she didn't want me to die in 5 or 10 years and have you take everything she worked for and spend it on, what, condos and cars and pyramid schemes and lawsuits with your ex-husbands. She didn't want that to be her legacy. Her legacy is going to be teachers like she was." My son said, "This is insane. This is elder abuse. She manipulated you. She was sick. She was on medication. She didn't know what she was doing." I said, "She knew exactly what she was doing. There's video. Mr. Kessling has it. 2 cameras. A doctor's affidavit dated the same day. She was clear, she was lucid, and she was very, very specific." I would not recommend pursuing that line. He sat down again. Brittany, who had not said a word the entire time, finally looked up from her phone. She said, "So there's nothing? Like nothing?" I said, "There's the house eventually. After I die, it's left to a land trust. It will become a community garden. Your mother's idea." Brittany said, "A community garden." I said, "Yes." She put her phone in her purse. She stood up. She said, "I'll be in the car." She left. My son watched her go. Something in his face changed. I watched it change. I had seen that face before when he was 19 and I confronted him about the credit card. The hurt little boy face that he used when he wanted me to forgive him. He said, "Pop, please don't do this." I said, "I'm not doing anything. Your mother already did it. 6 weeks before she died, while you were ignoring her phone calls." He said, "I called her." I said, "You called her 3 times in the last 4 months of her life." I know because I checked her phone records. 3 times. 2 of those calls were under 4 minutes. His mouth opened. It closed. My daughter said, in a very small voice, "I called her every week." I said, "You called her every week and asked her for money. I have those records too." She started to cry harder. The dog, sensing emotion, came over and licked her face. She pushed it away. I said, "I want you both to listen to me, because I am only going to say this once." They looked at me. I said, "Your mother loved you. She loved you both more than I can describe. She loved you even when you broke her heart. And you broke her heart often. And you broke her heart at the end, when she needed you the most. She loved you even when she signed the papers. The last thing she said to me about either of you was that she hoped, someday, you would understand what she did, and that you would be better people for it." That was her hope, not her expectation. Her hope. I paused. I said, "I'm 67. I'm in good health. The doctor says I have another 15, 20 good years if I take care of myself. That's a long time, and I'm going to spend that time in this house with my memories of her, and I'm going to make sure her foundation gets started, and I'm going to read books, and I'm going to garden, and I'm going to live, and I'm not going to give either of you another dollar. Not for emergencies, not for condos, not for credit card debt, not for grandchildren I never get to see, not for anything. Because every time I gave you money, I was making it easier for you to be the kind of people who wouldn't show up to your mother's funeral, and I'm done doing that." My son said, "Dad." He had not called me Dad in 15 years. It had been Pop, always Pop, ever since he started college. The dad hit me harder than I expected. I held my ground. I said, "I love you. Both of you. I will always love you. You're my children, but love doesn't mean money. Your mother taught me that, finally, when she was dying. I wish I'd learned it sooner. I would have been a better father if I had. My daughter said, 'Daddy, please.' I said, 'If you want to come to dinner, if you want to call me on Sunday afternoons, like your mother used to call her mother. If you want to bring my grandchildren to see me. If you want to actually be in my life. You can. The door is open. The door has always been open. But there is no money. There will never be money, and if that means you don't want to come, then I'll have my answer, and we'll all know where we stand." My son stood up. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to talk to my lawyer." I said, "You should. He'll save you a lot of time." He walked out. My daughter sat on the couch for another minute. The dog was now under the coffee table, asleep. She looked at me, and for 1 second, 1 true second, I saw my little girl. The one who used to climb into my lap at 6 years old and ask me to read her the Frog and Toad books. The one who used to draw pictures of our family on construction paper. 4 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. She said, "Was she really that disappointed in me?" I said, "She wasn't disappointed in you, sweetheart. She was disappointed for you." She said, "I don't know what that means." I said, "I know. That's the problem." She got up. She picked up the dog. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and I thought, for that moment, she might say something else. Something real. But she didn't. She just nodded, and she left. I went to the window. I watched my son's German SUV pull out of the driveway. My daughter got into a rideshare car that had been waiting. They left in opposite directions. Brittany was in the front seat of the SUV, already laughing at something on her phone. I went into the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea, the way Margaret had liked it, with 2 slices of lemon and a teaspoon of honey. I took it out to the back porch. I sat in the wicker chair where she had told me what she wanted me to do. The cardinal was at the feeder. I said out loud, "It's done, sweetheart. I did it." The wind moved through the maple at the edge of the yard. The cardinal flew off. The porch was very quiet. My son sued. He retained an expensive firm out of Atlanta, and they spent 11 months and, I am told, somewhere north of $200,000 of his own money trying to break the trust. They failed. Mr. Kessling and Margaret had been very thorough. The judge dismissed the suit with prejudice. My son has not spoken to me since. My daughter went quieter for about 6 months. Then, one Sunday, she called. She didn't ask for money. She talked about a yoga class she was taking that she actually liked. She asked how I was doing. We talked for 19 minutes. She called the next Sunday too, and the one after that. It has been almost a year now. She came to visit, alone, no dog, in the spring. She helped me plant tomatoes. She didn't mention money once. I don't know if it will last. But I am letting myself hope. The foundation launched in March. It awarded its first 12 grants to elementary school teachers in 3 states, money for classroom supplies and graduate education, and, in one case, for a teacher to take a sabbatical to write a book about literacy. The board sent me pictures. I have them on the refrigerator next to the picture from Maine. I go to the cemetery on Saturdays. I bring flowers from the garden when there are flowers. I sit on a small folding stool I keep in the trunk of my car. I tell her about my week. I told her, the Saturday after the foundation announced the first grants, that she had been right. About all of it. About the children, about the money, about what love is and what love isn't. I told her I missed her every minute of every day. I told her I was going to be all right. The wind moved through the maples at the edge of the cemetery. A cardinal landed on a headstone 2 rows over. I watched it for a long time. Then it flew off, and I picked up my stool, and I drove home through a town I had lived in for 43 years, past the school where she had taught, past the diner where we had eaten our first meal as husband and wife, past the small white house where we had raised 2 children who, in the end, did not know us, and back to a porch where I sit, sometimes, in the late afternoon, with a cup of tea that I make exactly the way she used to like it, and I am alone, and I am not lonely, and that, I think, is the difference she was trying to teach me all along. I sat on my back porch the morning after my son's lawsuit was dismissed, and I tried to understand how I had raised 2 children who could not bring themselves to stand in the rain for an hour to say goodbye to the woman who carried them. I did not arrive at a clean answer. I am not sure there is one. But I came close to something, and I want to tell you what it was, because it took me 67 years to learn it, and I would rather you learn it sooner. Every dollar I gave my daughter without asking what it was for, every excuse I made for my son's first wife and second wife, and the credit card and the lies, every time I told myself that love meant softening every edge, so they never had to feel the bite of their own choices, I was not being kind. I was being a coward. Margaret saw it before I did. She tried to tell me, gently, for 30 years. I did not listen, because listening would have meant admitting that I had been wrong, and pride is the most expensive thing a man can carry. The cause was mine. The effect was theirs. They became people who skipped a funeral, because for 40 years I had taught them that nothing they did would ever cost them anything. You cannot raise a child in a house where consequences do not exist, and then act surprised when they grow into adults who cannot recognize one when it stands in front of them in a black suit, holding an umbrella over an 84-year-old neighbor. What I have learned, late, is that real love has a spine. It is not the same as money, and it is not the same as comfort, and it is certainly not the same as silence. Real love says no when no is the truer word. Real love lets a grown man feel the weight of his own decisions, because that weight is the only thing that ever turned a boy into a man. I robbed my son of that weight for 30 years. I robbed my daughter too. Margaret knew what she was doing when she signed those papers 11 days before she died. She was not punishing them. She was finally giving them, at the very end, the one gift I had refused to give them their entire lives, which was the gift of standing on their own 2 feet without me underneath them. I am not bitter. I want you to understand that. I sit on this porch with a cup of tea, and I miss my wife, and I am, for the first time in a long while, at peace with myself. My daughter calls on Sundays now. She does not ask for money. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the beginning of something. My son may come around. He may not. Either way, I did the right thing, finally. And the right thing tends to be the harder thing, which is how you know it is right. If you are reading this and you are still holding the umbrella for grown people who should be holding their own, put it down. Let them feel the rain. It is the only weather that ever taught anyone anything.